On behalf of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and Washington State University, I want to welcome all of you to this event. I'm Todd Butler, and I serve as both interim dean of the WSU College of Arts and Sciences and director of its Center for Arts and Humanities. The center exists as a front door connecting audiences with the best of arts and humanities programming, and streaming this event worldwide certainly meets this definition. Today, we're coming to you from WSU's Pullman campus. And before we begin, I want to acknowledge the original peoples of the land we occupy. Now, it's something we do for every event, but it seems particularly important today as we begin to consider questions of individual and collective memories and the trauma and courage that can accompany them. So the Washington State University Pullman campus is located on the homelands of the Namipu or Nez Perce tribe and the Palouse people. We acknowledge their presence here since time immemorial and recognize their continuing connection to the land, to the water, and to their ancestors. I'd now like to turn things over to Dr. Ray Sun, Professor of History and Faculty Fellow in the WSU Center for Arts and Humanities, who will be moderating this event.
Thank you, Todd. Hello, everyone. So I also want to thank the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum for partnering with Washington State University for the Meyerhoff Lecture. Today's event kicks off several years of programming with WSU and other institutions in the Pacific Northwest to strengthen education on the Holocaust and its many applications to our contemporary society and culture. As a land-grant institution, Washington State University has a special responsibility to advance, extend, and apply knowledge through scholarship and teaching for the greater good. Welcome, Dr. Neiman. So let's begin our discussion. So my first question is, in light of recent events from summer 2020 to January 2021, your findings about post-war German memories seem more urgently relevant for Americans than ever. But most Americans are unfamiliar with the decades-long process of what Germans call working off the past, or Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung. What's a good starting point for Americans to understand how Germans came to terms with the legacy of Nazism and the Holocaust?
The first thing to know is this work is really hard, and it's so hard that even the Germans had a really long and difficult time doing it. We tend not to know that outside of Germany. We tend to assume that the crimes of the Nazis were so obvious and horrendous that the minute the war was over, people got down on their knees, Germans got down on their knees and begged for atonement. And that belief is reinforced by the iconic picture of Willy Brandt kneeling at the Warsaw Ghetto Memorial in 1970. What people outside Germany don't know is that Brandt's gesture was extremely unpopular among his country people, who did not think they had anything to apologize for, at least the majority at the time. When I first came to Berlin in 1982, thinking I was going to stay for a year on a Fulbright fellowship and go back home and have a traditional academic career, plenty of people told me that their parents and their teachers were Nazis. They were not shy about that at all. Most of them had quite broken relationships with their families because of that. But what they never told me was that their parents and teachers not only fought for the Nazis, or at least didn't do anything to stop them, but that they also considered themselves the worst victims of the war. And they partly didn't tell me because it seemed to them obvious. They partly didn't tell me, I think, out of a sense of shame. But as I began to read things that were written, particularly in West Germany in the first couple of decades after the war, I suddenly realized that they used exactly the same tropes that defenders of the lost cause in America use. We lost the war. Our cities were burned to the ground. Our men were either killed or wounded or in prison camps. Our children were starving. And on top of that, the damn Yankees wanted to tell us that the war was all our fault. you read exactly those things if you look at what post-war Germans were saying. And I realized that there's actually a very sort of very important structure here. We all want to believe that our people are heroes. That's a quite natural thing to want. If there's a big red flag and you can't see your people as a complete hero, the next best thing is to see them as a victim and to think, well, they could have been heroes, but history made them victims. The Germans did something that no other country has ever done, even though it was a long and very hard struggle. They made a third step and they said, well, yes, we did suffer in the war and certainly after the war, but other people suffered more and their suffering was our fault. And no nation has ever done that, which is really quite important. Now, they haven't done it perfectly. There's still a lot of work to be done. I wrote that working off the past is not an inoculation, it's not a one-shot effort that will, prevent you from being racist forever and ever. What is absolutely certain is that this process is a complicated one. It starts, of course, with bringing people to justice insofar as you can still find them and making sure that people who really were criminals spend hopefully the rest of their lives in jail. That happened, for example, only fairly recently in Mississippi with the Klansmen who ordered the murders of, for me, the great freedom fighters, Andrew Goodman, James Chaney, and Mickey Schwerner in Freedom Summer in 1964. It took 40 years to bring him to justice, but he did die in jail recently. So questions of that kind of justice, belong to this process. Much more important are constructing different historical narratives. And those narratives are not just constructed through school books, although school books are terribly important. They're very much constructed by popular culture. I think movies and books and even sometimes music are at least as important as the messages that we receive in school. Things like monuments are important. What we take down, what we put up in its place, all of those things need to be discussed, hopefully, individually and within communities. I perhaps would like to add that it's very important that nations also have heroes. This is something that Brian Stevenson, the creator of the incredible lynching memorial in Alabama, said to me when I interviewed him for the book. He said, there were white people who were opposed to lynching in the South, and you don't know their names. And it's important that we remember those names too. That is, a national understanding of our history doesn't have to be and shouldn't ever be a list of all the crimes that have been committed in Americans' names. Those need to be examined and remembered, but we also need to remember the people who stood up for justice throughout our entire history. And that is going to be a process. And, those will be discussions that Americans will be having now for decades, and they'll probably last beyond my lifetime. But I do think that by looking at what the Germans did, we won't get a roadmap, but we'll get some really interesting suggestions for what we need to do in America.
Okay, well, let's dive down into some of the details about how the Germans worked through this very difficult process. And let's start by referring back to the title slide for this presentation. And as you know, it shows a young American soldier removing a street sign for Adolf Hitler Strasse, which means Adolf Hitler Street. And he's replacing it with one called Roosevelt Strasse. So, Dr. Neiman, do you care to play off of that as a metaphor for the West German experience and how they dealt with the Nazi past?
What's important is that it's an American soldier who's doing that. Now, the Nazi regime didn't last all that long. It was a little more than 12 years. And that wasn't enough time to build a lot of statues. So there weren't actually a lot of memorials of that kind to take down. But there were an awful lot of Adolf Hitler, the streets and squares and all of that. And one of the first things the Allies did was to ban them, to ban the swastikas that were placed on many buildings. And, you know, that was when the four allies, it was really three allies. The French got in very late, but it was the Americans, the Soviet Union, and the English were all working together at that point. And they managed to work together long enough to hold the trials at Nuremberg, which, although they're important in the history of human rights, because they show that even if an action may have been legal under state law at the time, the world community decided that there is a law of conscience that should override whatever national law is. So those trials were very important, but the West Germans in particular dismissed them as victor's justice. Of course, the people who won get to call the shots. They were not taken seriously at all. Very few people, a tiny number of people were executed. A slightly larger number of people were jailed in West Germany. The Cold War had already started, so there was a very different process going on in East Germany, which we'll get to. And the sentences of those not many people in West Germany were very quickly commuted, and they were very quickly let back in their official careers, with some exceptions, but they're not very many. The philosopher Martin Heidegger, for example, was not, or Carl Schmitt were not allowed to teach, something that they railed against with fury for till the end of their lives. One misunderstanding that people often have about the Nazis is that they were, a poor, unwashed, ignorant mob, and that's why they went for Hitler. In fact, the greatest number of Nazi party members had academic degrees. They belonged to the middle or even the upper classes, and they staffed the universities, the schools, the police departments, the justice departments, and much of the government of West Germany until basically they retired in the late 60s and mid 70s. So, the picture is appropriate as a comment on the fact that this was not a homegrown initiative. This was initially something that the Allies instituted. And because the Allies instituted it, there was an awful lot of resentment for the initial attempt to deal with the crimes of the Nazis.
So what then was the push that enabled the West Germans to sort of own this process for themselves?
So beginning in the very late 50s, but especially in the 60s, there were a number of groups that were coming of age. It was not just a generational change, but it was partly a generational change. Things like the Eichmann trial, and more importantly for Germans, the Auschwitz trials in Frankfurt in 1964, brought many people a sense of shock, horror, disgust, and rage. at the people who had allowed this to happen. So there were church groups, there were student groups, there were groups of artists and intellectuals, and this was not supported at all by the national government. There was a brief moment when Willy Brandt, who's a social democrat, did get into power for about 2.5 years. And that was part of this wave that was happening in the end of the 60s. Brandt himself had absolutely nothing to apologize for. As a social democrat, he fled to Norway shortly after the Nazis took power. But his flight was actually used to reproach him by Konrad Adenauer, the first chancellor of West Germany, who actually said as a campaign slogan, "What was Herr Brandt doing abroad for 12 years? We know what we were doing in Germany." That is the very thing that made Willy Brandt a good German in the eyes of the rest of the world, was used by many of his compatriots well through the 70s to count him as a bad German who hadn't stood with his homeland. But there were these waves. Brandt, partly because he got so much opposition, did not last very long in power. Various reasons for it is complicated. We don't have time to go into it. But you had these grassroots movements of people who were insisting that the nation confront its Nazi past, and who did it in very literal ways. This is what I was so moved by in 1982, and why I didn't go back to Harvard, because I was fascinated with the process. I was fascinated with people who were exploring their local histories, the histories of their neighborhoods. People were literally digging up the ruins of concentration camps or Gestapo torture chambers and saying, we need to remember this. We cannot brush this under the carpet. They were making films, they were making art exhibits, there were, no end of discussions. And through that popular movement, it finally pushed West Germany to a point where in 1985, the West German president, Richard von Weizsäcker, made a groundbreaking speech in which he said May 8th, which is the day of the end of the war, was a day of liberation. Before that, in West Germany, it had been known as the day of defeat or the day of the unconditional surrender. So to call it a day of liberation was a way of saying the Nazis were criminals and we're glad that someone liberated us from them. Now, it's very important to point out that the East Germans had been calling it the Day of Liberation from day one. But again, that's a different story.
So why don't we go into how the East Germans dealt with the Nazi past now? And so one of the most striking anecdotes in your book, I think, is when you describe participating in a conference in Minnesota in 1993. And this is a couple of years after German reunification. And it was addressing concerns about racism, the reemergence of racism in reunified Germany. And so you were invited to represent Jews who lived in Germany. And there was also an Afro-German woman and a Turkish man. So you're all invited to speak as representatives of those who might have suffered racism from personal experience, but the rest of the speakers and participants at the conference were West Germans. And so in your book, you write that my talk had nothing to do with East-West comparisons. The one sentence mentioned that I felt more comfortable as a Jew and a foreigner in East than West Berlin. The room erupted. The claim was incidental to my talk. It was all anyone wished to discuss. The West Germans were enraged, and one after the other stood up to correct me. So let's run with this. Why were the West Germans so upset that day? And then what does this tell us actually about how you saw how East Germany dealt with the Nazi past.
Let me step back and say something about the development in East Germany. I think many Americans know the famous statement of the pastor Martin Niemöller. First, they came for the communists, but I wasn't a communist, so I didn't say anything. And then they came for the socialists, but I wasn't a socialist, and I didn't say anything. It's a very famous quote, and it's meant to capture the quite right political claim. Once anybody's civil rights are threatened, eventually everyone's civil rights will be threatened. But what people forget is that this is also a historical claim. First, they did come for the communists, and then they did come for the socialists. And what that means for the history of the two Germanys is that when the war was finally over, the people who led East Germany were real anti-fascists. They had either spent the war in concentration camps or they had spent it in exile. And they were committed absolutely in their bones to, wiping out as much of the Nazi past as was possible. They were also very concerned about what to do with a population that had been living for 12 years under Nazi propaganda and certainly wasn't going to change overnight because the leadership had changed. And that's one of the reasons why some of the East German, what shall I say? There was more censorship. There was a real concern about what do we do? How quickly can we change the minds of this population? So what one really has to remember, and what has been forgotten, not only in the United States, but also still in West Germany in many circles, is that Nazism had several pillars. It was not only based on anti-Semitism. That was certainly a major pillar of Nazism. But it was also racist in general, first of all. There were 14 million Slavic civilians who were murdered on the Eastern Front. The plans that they drew up for what they would do in Africa are extraordinary. I mean, they planned to enslave all of Africa and, commit genocide where they had to. So this was not just an anti-Semitic regime, it was a racist nationalist regime in general. And that is something that East Germans picked up on. Sometimes they've been accused by, not of being anti-Semitic because they didn't foreground anti-Semitism. They discussed it as part of a general attack on all non-Aryan peoples, okay? But there were still many more films and books about the persecution and murder of the Jews that were made in East Germany than in West Germany. But it's also true that the other pillar of Nazi ideology, besides racism in general, was anti-communism, largely because communism, for all of its perversions in the Soviet Union, was a universalist movement. So the East Germans went to work. They jailed and tried far more former Nazis than were ever tried or jailed in the West. They got far more out of office, not all of them. Pretty hard to get everybody out of office because there were so many of them, but most of them. They completely rewrote the school books. They published an awful lot of, again, films, over 1,000 films, over 1,000 books have been cataloged. They rebuilt the concentration camp Buchenwald to serve as a museum and a research center, and every school child in East Germany had to visit it. That they didn't tell the whole story of Buchenwald and that they sometimes instrumentalized it is also true, okay? But that if you grew up in East Germany, you learn the fundamental message: the Nazis were criminals and defeating them was a blessing, is just true. And you did not know that in most of West Germany. So while I don't want to, defend at all everything about East Germany, it's still the case that they did a better job of dealing with the Nazi past.
Just to go back to something that you'd said in your first remarks, and you're really interested in the role of culture and symbolism in rebuilding this new narrative that you say is necessary for any nation to confront difficult aspects of its past. And so I'd just like to ask, what are some of your favorite examples of German memorialization or culture that have contributed towards this overall German process of coming to terms with the past?
Probably the most successful example of a German memorial has been the so-called stumbling stones. These are small brass plaques about 4 inches square. They are placed in front of buildings where people, mostly Jews who were deported, but other people who were persecuted by the Nazis, lived. It has the date of their births, date of their deportation, and of their death, if known, and of course their names. This was an independent project started by the artist Gunther Demnig in the early 90s, and it has now grown to 70,000 all over the world. And they're meant to remind you that, yes, the death camps in Poland were quite far away under those, circumstances of the times, but, the Holocaust ended in the death camps. It didn't start there. It started right where you live, that you're going to walk by on your way to the market or the dentist or wherever it is you're going that day. And I think they're extremely powerful. What Demnig now does, many people want stumbling stones. Sometimes people want a stumbling stone for their relative. And in the case of a relative, it's a little easier. The person who wants a stumbling stone has to pay 120 euros. I'd say that's about $130. So it's, it's not a crazy amount of money. It's something that often people who live together in an apartment building raise together. But more importantly, these are Germans now who didn't have relatives lost during the Nazi period, but who feel they want to honor someone who once lived in their building, and they have to do research on the person. They really have to learn about their history, and and then they're put on a list. And when the time is, poor Demnig, he's in his 70s, he still does I believe he does all of these, maybe almost all of these himself. Puts one. Now, what's very important for American purposes is that Brian Stevenson told me he was enormously impressed by the stumbling stones, and part of his lynching monument is actually based on that principle. That is, there's a double monument. There's the monument that you walk into and are overwhelmed by, and with columns of each county in which the Equal Justice Initiative has documented lynchings. But the columns are doubled outside, and the idea is that each county should come and take back its column, also after doing suitable research about the people who were lynched. So, I think it's tremendously important. I take monuments seriously, but I think it's important that they not just be off somewhere, that we be reminded that, genocide doesn't start with genocide. It starts much slower and much more insidiously. Of course, one of the interesting things about Germany is the variety of monuments to the victims of the Holocaust and of other Nazi crimes, as well as to the very few people who did resist it. Anybody walking through Berlin in particular will probably be astonished by how present the past is. And I think that as Americans think about what we want to take down and what we want to put up in their places, we should really learn from that variety. That there are many ways. I'll give you another example of a monument I love that's right in the center of Berlin. People who know a bit about the history of the Third Reich will know that quite early on, a mob of people walked out into this really Berlin Central Square and burnt piles of books, both of Jewish authors, communist authors, various people they considered to be not German enough. Now, the mob consisted, this is not, again, not something that many people know. It's right across from Berlin's major university. The mob consisted of students and professors throwing books into the flames. Today, there is a very interesting monument. There's a plaque with a quote from the German Jewish poet Heinrich Heine, which says, "Once people start burning books, they will wind up burning people." And you look down; it's quite small in this vast square, and an Israeli artist has built underground a series of just white empty bookcases. So you look down and you see all of the books. I mean, you don't see the books, but you're reminded of all of the great books that were burnt on that place. So, that's another very moving monument, but there are many.
I'm just going to close, Dr. Neiman, with offering you the opportunity to give your thoughts about contemporary German memory towards the Nazi era. What trends, if any, do you see? There are some concerns that the rise of the far right in Germany may have slowed this down or turned it back. I'd just be interested in your thoughts on the current situation and where you think German memory work might be going.
Subject of intense discussion within Germany. What I have to point out is that for all that I and most Germans are extremely unhappy that for the first time since the war, we have a radical right party in parliament that won enough votes to be in parliament. You have to get over the 5% hurdle so that you don't have, as was the case in the Weimar Republic, just many, many tiny parties competing for seats. But for the first time since the war, the so-called Alternative for Deutschland, the AfD, won enough seats in parliament to get in. And they based their policy on both anti-immigrant, demonstrations and being opposed precisely to the working off of the past that has gone on in the last many decades. One of their favorite politicians made a speech in which he said, "No other nation in the world has a mark of shame in the heart of its capital," referring to the large Holocaust monument that really is in central, the most central symbolic place you could put it in Germany. And although I'm not crazy about that monument, I admire the German people for taking prime real estate the size of, I think, 4 football fields right in the middle of next to the Brandenburg Gate, which is kind of the symbol of reunited Germany, and saying, no, we need to remember our shame as well. So this right-wing party campaigned on 2 platforms. One is we don't like immigrants, and the other is we don't like all this talking about the bad parts of our nation's past. Germany is becoming also a much more diverse country, and that people are saying, wait a sec, we can't just focus on anti-Semitism. We also have to think about the legacy of colonialism and what we're going to do about that. So that is something that has, really picked up steam after looking at Black Lives Matter in May and June.
It's really an interesting insight into how we actually are linked so closely. What happens here with Black Lives Matter has been having a direct impact on German culture and politics, and one for a needed conversation in Germany, just as we need it in our country. So I think we're out of time. So Dr. Neiman, I just want to thank you again for your time and sharing of your expertise and your thoughtful responses to these questions. And I know that our students and faculty around the Pacific Northwest are going to be benefiting from this throughout the spring semester. So I want to wish you well. I will look forward to the second edition of Learning from the Germans, and just good luck with all your future work. It's been a pleasure working with you.
Thank you very much, Ray, and it's been a great pleasure to talk to you as well.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.